And welcome back. We are going to, in this lesson, take a step back and look at file types. Because as we are now diving into making animations, it's important first to take a look and ask ourselves the important question of what file do I actually need? What type of file am I going to produce that's going to make the end product that I want? So when we start looking at this, it's very important to kind of stop and wonder, what exactly is that file that we're trying to produce? So what do we want that image to be used for is the first question that we should ask here. Will that image, for example, be printed? Is it going to be displayed on a web page? Will it be part of a game or an application? Because all these things are going to really kind of drive how we create that image, what size we do, what specifications we're setting in front of it. Because, for example, if we're doing a print image, we're going to probably work more of a CMYK color palette versus if we're going more for, let's say, a web page, we might be doing web-based colors or RGB because, again, those are going to be more like their web safe palette. So there's different things that we're going to have to work with based upon where we are at. Now, we also need to ask, what do we want that image to do? Is it going to be a static image? For example, if it's going to be on a web page, is it simply just there to act as a background image? Or is it a picture that I'm trying to show off about some cool event or activity that's going on? Will that image need to be animated? Is it a GIF where we want it to have a certain action happen within the time frame that we have that image displayed? Or will it need multiple frames of animation? Are we looking at something like, for example, a 2D sprite video game, and we want that character to have the appropriate frame so when they're walking on the screen, based upon if they're moving up, moving down, left, right, etc., how that character is going to look based upon that movement. So this, of course, leads us back to the types of files we have to work with. And when we start talking of types of files, there's two things that we have to talk about. The first is this idea of lossy versus lossless. So this is really your compression that goes on to really reduce your file size, because ultimately you could have, for example, raw image files, which is just a raw chunk of data, but that's going to be very large. And of course, anytime you have something that's really large, it creates more need for resources. So we look at algorithms to find a way to reduce that file size without compromising what we want to do. And in both lossy and lossless compression, images are using algorithms to reduce the file size. Whereas lossy images, these are things like JPEG, WebP, etc., these file sizes are done by removing chunks of data physically out of the image. So it's literally transforming your image. And this is typically done by taking out things that, for example, the human eye would not normally be able to see, or it's a little background information that isn't as important. So the algorithm kind of goes through and physically removes those data. Now, the thing we call it lossy because if you were to try and restore that original data, you would find it impossible to do so because, again, it's been kind of removed. So once it's gone, it's gone. Compare that to a lossless image, so BMP, PNG, TIFF, etc. These are using algorithms that compress the file size without data loss. So what happens is when you use this compression, it takes the image, renders it down to a smaller size, and then when it's time for you to use it, it's going to restore that data and using these mathematical algorithms to kind of determine, okay, what was here in this location, so you're not necessarily compromising image quality at the cost of file size. And the other thing that we look at when we start talking about types of images is, of course, the idea of vector images versus raster images. And we aren't going to talk about that too much in this course here, but it's still important for us to note what these are. Raster images are things like JPEGs, PNGs, GIFs, etc. These are images that are built from pixels. And that's what we've been working with in this space, is pixel art, right? So we're using pixel art to form highly detailed images. And these are all rastered images. They're all rasterized by the program to create a PNG, a GIF, whatever we're looking for it to make. On the other hand, vector images, these are, for example, Adobe Illustrator files, SVG, etc. These are using mathematical equations, lines, and curves with fixed points on a grid to ultimately produce an image that way. And the nice thing about a vector image versus a raster is they don't have the same scaling issues that a raster image would have. For example, remember when we looked at scaling an image and we scaled it up and we lost a lot of data because things were distorted, or the program had to make, for example, best guesses about where certain things would go within that image. there were different algorithms that we could choose, like nearest neighbor versus bicubic and stuff like that, to try and make better guesses about how we want that final image to make. But again, that's all using a rasterized approach, whereas the vector image, because it is all using a mathematical approach, no matter what size I make that image, it's always going to hold to the same proportions, to the same dimensions. It's going to have the same look, no matter what size it is set to. So let's take all that and wrap that into what we have done so far. So we have several file types that we've been exposed to. The first, of course, is PNG, Portable Networks Graphics. These are the ones that when we go to File and Export and we save our wonderful work that we've done in Photoshop, these, of course, are PNGs. That is our end product. What we would normally show off to somebody if we were to present them, we could probably present them as PNGs. The other thing that we have seen at this point is, of course, a PSD or a Photoshop document. If you've been saving, of course, to the cloud, you might have a PSDC, which is a Photoshop document cloud because it's saving in the cloud, but it's ultimately still kind of the same format. So these are the documents that we use to make our files, our images within Photoshop itself. This is what Photoshop uses to record the different things such as the layers, the different filters, the different effects, gradients, etc. that we're using are all within this document. Now, of course, the other file format that we haven't yet talked about that we've been kind of beating around the bush a little bit here is GIF, all right, or the graphics interchange format. This, of course, is the new format that we're going to be working with here very shortly. That is, of course, going to help us deep dive into making animated images. And next time, let's start cracking that egg a little bit and hopefully get into actually making and taking our first steps towards making those GIFs.